Is the sound working? Good morning, folks. I'm going to try and get started right on time because I have a lot of material to cover today. Couple things really quickly. There's surveys at the back. I'd love to, and the conference would too, love to get your feedback at the end. My name is Bindu Wavell. I'm the chief architect at Zia Consulting. And this deck is actually about 30% longer than what I'm going to present to you. I've got a bunch of hidden slides. So if you find it interesting, go download the deck from the Summit site, summit.alfresco.com. And there's a lot of code samples and config samples and things that I didn't have time to talk about in this session. So without further ado, I was told that I should start with this story, so I just made this one up. But as we're kind of doing our everyday jobs with Alfresco, whether that's administration or programming, a lot of times stuff comes up that's like, oh, we need to reindex all the PDFs, or there's, in this case, there's a bunch of stuff that's publicly accessible and we need to lock it down. And a lot of times that's really urgent, and you're like, oh crap, I have to do this. And well, in this case, it's a security issue. You could just turn off the network connection to the repository, right? Like, just nobody has access. I'll get in and I'll fix it all, and then we'll turn it back on. But that's probably not acceptable. So other things, like you might write a Java program to fix this, you'd have to restart the repository, right? So you'd write some code, or you'd go manually find stuff, and it would take a really long time. So what I'm going to talk about today is some techniques you can use to actually write administration tools using JavaScript that run in the repository, and they don't require you to restart, right? So you can quickly go through and process information in the repository. So the couple things that I'd love you to kind of get out of the talk are some tips and tricks on how to be even more of a content hero. So when stuff's going on in your organization, especially when it's kind of high stress, you can really help out, and to use JavaScript to do that. So just briefly, some things that you can do with this tooling. You can fix problems with content, so that might be access control. It might be issues with metadata. It might be that you need to move things around because they're in the wrong place. Also with migrations, a lot of times, we'll use the bulk file system import tool. I think there's actually another talk on that right now. Use the bulk file system import tool to bring a bunch of data into the system really quickly and efficiently. It's a great tool, and you can set up metadata, but you may need to then bring extra metadata in, or set up relationships, or do renditioning, or things like that after you've gotten the stuff into the repo. So this is a good set of tools for building that, especially things that are sort of one-time use. You just kind of want to hack something pretty quickly. Doesn't need to be production grade. You just want to get something out quickly. And then there's some reporting and analytics stuff you can do where maybe you have a Lucene query or a CMIS query that you can run to find some information, but then you need to do a little processing on that. Maybe you'd do a CMIS query, you'd export it, you'd put it into Excel, you'd do that processing, but you can actually do that right in the repo using these tools. So basically, in order to write admin scripts for the repo, you're going to want to store the scripts in the repository. So there's already a folder in every repo, data dictionary scripts, and your admin scripts are going to go under there. Now you can have subfolders, and I would encourage you to do that so that you don't end up with hundreds of scripts in one folder that are hard to find. You don't have to. You can just go right under this folder, but you can have subfolders, and that's not widely understood, so I just wanted to make sure folks knew that. And then the other thing I wanted to call out right up front is that you can make libraries. So a script that has, for example, logging functionality. Maybe you have 3 or 4 different ways to do logging that sort of extend the out-of-the-box stuff. You put that into a script file, and then other scripts can import your logging library. So this is the syntax for that, and you don't need to remember it now. You can download the deck. So once you have a script in the repository, you want to run it, right? An administrative script. So in Share, there's one sort of way that you can run a script, which is you could make a folder rule, right? And in the folder rules, there's an execute script action. So you could make a rule on a folder, and you could drop stuff on that folder and execute your script. But that's not that useful in a lot of cases. It's useful in a lot of cases, but especially for admin stuff, it's not. So there is, out of the box, Share has this execute script action, under the More menu, but it's not enabled by default. So in Share Config Custom, there's actually a commented out config block that you can just uncomment. And what you'll see is when you go to More on a folder, you'll see this execute script. It's highlighted here on the screen. And when you select that, it'll then give you the list of all of the scripts under your data dictionary scripts folder. So you can select your script, and you can now run your script. And a nice thing is when you're running the script against a document or a folder, there's actually a variable in that script called document, even if it's a folder, which is the thing you ran the script on. So some scripts, you don't really care where they're run. You're going to do a search. You're going to find the stuff you care about. But some of them you might want to say, hey, process this hierarchy or process this one document. So that's useful. What I would highly recommend is that you actually use this add-on, open source add-on called the JavaScript Console. In my opinion, this is the best add-on for Alfresco, the most useful add-on for Alfresco. Lots of other ones that are great, do lots of specialized things. This one's really generic. Pretty much, I think every implementation could use this. So I highly recommend it. And basically, you get the same, under the More, you now have this use JavaScript console, same as execute script, but instead of giving you that little pop-up, you get this sort of interactive JavaScript development environment. So you can actually write code here and run it. You'll notice in the top left it says var document equals, the name of the document that we ran or the folder we ran the script on. So you could just quickly bang out a piece of code. Let's say you want to set a piece of metadata that's not exposed in a form. Right? You could actually just come in here and say document.properties, property name equals blah, and set that value, document.save. Now you've updated that. You don't want to save that script, so it's ephemeral. And this is really great for that, right? You can just kind of quickly do little things. But you can also load scripts from your scripts folder using the load button in the top right. You can fix scripts. It does syntax highlighting. It'll do automatic formatting. The new version, 0.6, will do auto-completion of all of the out-of-the-box stuff, plus your functions. It will do, there's theming. There's a bunch of stuff for web script development that you probably won't care about, like free marker and things like that. It's a great, great tool. And I just would highly recommend, if you're not using it, that you do. So diving in to the kind of actual mechanics of writing some of these scripts, the first thing we need to talk about is that there's runtimes, right? So there's this, in Alfresco, they have this concept of a scripting runtime. And the only one that's there out of the box is the JavaScript scripting runtime. So that means scripts under your data dictionary scripts folder that are JavaScript documents will be executable by this scripting runtime. There are other runtimes that you can add for, I think, Ruby and Groovy and Clojure, other things like that. But the only one out of the box is this JavaScript one. And they're using the Mozilla Rhino project, which is a Java library that interprets and runs JavaScript code. And it's a little bit hacked, but it's, if you go out and find resources for Mozilla Rhino, they'll generally be applicable. What that allows you to do is have some interop, right? So when you go to run a script, using alfresco will put some objects into the JavaScript runtime. And those are actually Java objects, but you can use them from JavaScript. So it's this interoperability thing. And you can, in fact, if you make your own extensions, you can actually pass JavaScript strings and functions and arrays to your Java code, and then you can have Java code that processes those. So that kind of just gives you a little bit of a sense of this runtime. And the root objects that Alfresco posts in there, things like document, right? So that the document that you ran the script on, things like company home, so you can get a handle on the kind of base of the repository that you would browse through. There is one of the kind of strange things with this runtime is there's a concept of whether the script is secure or insecure. So with a secure script, you can basically do anything that Rhino will let you do, including using a root object called packages. And the packages root object will allow you to access anything in Java. And I'll give you an example of that later, where we're actually going to dive in and do some kind of deep, we're going to access the Java API in a cool way. But that'll only work if your script is secure. Scripts, admin scripts, generally, like if you use the alfresco script action, execute script action, that script will not be marked as secure. So you won't have access to the packages root object. If you use the JavaScript console, your scripts are marked as secure. So you get access to some deeper stuff. And it also adds some extra things like a print root object and things like that that are helpful. So that's that. And let's just go through a few of the root objects that Alfresco will provide to you. Commonly, you'll have company home, document, which is the node your script was run on. Actions allow you to run repository actions like sending email, running other scripts, causing transformations to happen, applying aspects, removing aspects, things like that. There's a logger root object. There's a searching root object that will allow you to do Lucene searching. It'll allow you to do CMIS searching. There's a paging helper root object for building pagers. We'll talk about some of this stuff more later. You'll notice I've highlighted a couple of these things, and I've said that they are script nodes, or they return a list of script nodes. Script node is this Java class in Alfresco, which, okay, I'll take a step back. When you're doing Java development with Alfresco, typically you have this thing called a node ref. It's like a URL for a node, right? It's a string. And most of the Java APIs, the services, you give a node ref and say you want to do something, check in, check out, get content, and so forth. With the scripting APIs, typically instead of getting just a node ref, you'll get this thing called a script node, which is essentially a wrapper around a node ref, but it gives you access to a lot of the base services. So instead of having to use the node service or the permission service or the authority service, a lot of the common things that you would do are just available. So if I have that document root object that is a script node, I can set properties on it. I can look at the permissions. I can check in and check out and so forth. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. There are certain cases where you're using Java APIs from JavaScript where you actually need to get at the node ref. You can get that from a script node. You can construct a script node from a node ref. That's kind of more detail than I want to go into today. I would just briefly point out, if you're setting properties using script node, you do need to call save. Because one of the things that it does is it buffers up all of your changes. So if you're using the Java API and you set properties, they get set right away. If you're using the script node, the JavaScript stuff, it buffers it. So you're not having, let's say you do 5 updates, you don't get 5 calls to the database, you get 1. Really quickly, the logging root object has 2 main methods. Logger.log by default will not write to the Alfresco log. It will write to the JavaScript console. So that can be useful as you kind of figure out your log levels. Logger.warn will write to the Alfresco log by default. So So that can also be helpful. A couple other things that you might do if you want to do logging. One is, you don't need to read this code in a lot of detail, but basically I have a log function here, and all it does is append to a string. So I build a big long string of all of my log messages. And then I have a log.write, which just creates a file in the repository and writes that string to it. And that's really nice, like if you have an administrator who isn't sort of, maybe they don't have access to the server to look at the Alfresco logs, or they find it hard to scan through the logs to find the log statements in between everything else, that can be a nice thing to do. Unfortunately, in the Rhino runtime, if you're appending to a string that's about 10 megabytes long, it does this very, very expensive reallocation, and it will slow down the whole server. So don't use this technique if, or anywise, don't add to strings that are more than 10 megs in JavaScript in Alfresco, because your repo will slow down, your scripts will be incredibly slow, orders of magnitude slower than if you don't do this. It's really a bad thing. So, balance that out. And another thing you could do is you could use the action root object, actions root object to send an email, right? Because there's an email action in the repository. So let's say you run a script and something interesting happens. You complete, or you have a failure, or you get to some milestone in your script. You can send out an email. Hey, this thing happened. I should mention, if you run a script from the UI and the script takes more than about 2 minutes to run, you'll get a timeout. I think the JavaScript console, that might be longer. It might be 10 minutes, but you'll still get a timeout if the script takes a long time to run. The script is still running. Unless there's actually an exception, it fails. But the timeout doesn't mean your script was killed. So if you're logging to the Alfresco log, you can go look, and you'll still see your output coming out. They just don't want to block the UI up for a long time. Wow, I'm running really ahead. That's awesome. So the JavaScript debugger, Alfresco has a debugger for JavaScript scripts built in. You go to the /alfresco/services/index, and there's a link at the bottom for the debugger. And when you enable this, what happens is any script that is run in the repository, whether it's a web script, whether it's an admin script, will essentially freeze on the first line, and it'll come up in this debugger, and you can single step or continue. You can inspect variables. So if you're on a live system that has a lot of web scripts using JavaScript, this is not very useful, because it will block all of your scripts. And you're like, run, right? It's not that fun. It is funny, but it's not fun. So in a controlled environment, this can be really helpful, right? So if you're on a dev environment, where you don't have a lot of scripts running and you just want to try out your admin script, this may be something that you want to use. I don't. I just use loggers. But if this is something you like, you want to have breakpoints, you want to inspect variables, this is something you can do. And I wanted to make sure and mention it to folks. So the meat and potatoes of this talk is, okay, we want to find content, and we want to process that content. So, and hopefully, if it's 2 or 3 things, you're probably going to go find them manually and make the changes manually, right? In this case, the idea is you're going to find a few hundred things, or a few thousand things, or tens of thousands of things, and you're going to process them. And I wanted to talk about the approaches you could use for doing that, for finding and processing. And I wanted to talk about kind of gotchas that you're going to run into with each of these approaches. None of them is perfect. So the 3 main approaches are, you could recurse over the content, right? So you could basically start at a folder and say, get all the children, and then go through the children's children and their children, and evaluate some business logic. And there are cases where that makes sense. For example, if you have a problem with your index, your Solr index is dead, and you need to go through and process some content, you can't use search. Or if you have holes in your index, this may be the approach you need to take, okay? Another alternative is to use search, right? That'll probably be a lot faster if your index is intact. And then you could also have, maybe you have a list of stuff that needs to happen. You get a, the business gives you a spreadsheet that says, here's a bunch of things that we need to have changed. And so maybe your script would process that CSV file and go through and say, okay, here's a row. Let me go find the related data in the repository and make the associated change. And then I'm going to talk about this thing called the alfresco batch processor, which will kind of tie a bunch of this together, but it's not an approach in and of itself. So I have a bunch of code samples now. You don't really need to spend a lot of time focusing on these, and there's a lot more samples in the deck if you download it. But I kind of wanted to call out some kind of common things we run into. So one case that we have for recursing over content is we needed to reindex PDFs. We were having a problem where PDFs were not indexed properly. So I can't use search. I have to iterate over the content. I have to find out, hey, is this a PDF document? And then all I want to do is just make some update to the node, which will trigger it being reindexed, right? And so that's what this script does. It's just a recursive, kind of goes down. You run the script on the parent folder that you want to process. It'll just go all the way down, and it will just set a piece of metadata and then unset it. And so it makes two changes, but it'll still only index it one time. This is a really useful tool. However, if you have a folder that has more than somewhere between 9,000 and 13,000 direct children, so not all the way underneath them, but directly inside the folder, this call in here to node.children will give you somewhere between 9 and 13,000 children, and then it will stop and you won't get any errors. So, if you have a lot of children, this may be problematic. So maybe you can use search in that case. So here's an example where basically we run into this all the time. Somebody says, hey, go delete this folder for us. And some hierarchy has thousands of documents under it. And there's like 2 documents way, way down underneath that are checked out. You can't delete the folder. Right? So you have to delete, go down, delete all the subfolders, find the one that fails, go down, delete all the subfolders, find the one that fails, kind of go through that process. It's terrible. So here's a script. All it does, you run it on a node. It does it does a search based on the document that you started on, so it doesn't go across the whole repo. And it's just using a Lucene query, and it says find everything that has the working copy aspect. That means it's checked out, right? So this just finds everything that's checked out. And in this case, I have a variable cancel checkout equals true. So I might just want to report on them and not check them out. So I'd set cancel checkout equals false. Then I might go have the business deal with fixing that. Or I might set cancel checkout to true. Just run through and cancel checkout on everything under that folder, and then I'll be able to delete that folder. The search root objects, Lucene search or just the base search, will return, if you're using Solr, it will return up to 1,000 items. If you're using Lucene, it may return less because the ACLs are processed as a post process. So you get 1,000 things from the search, and then things may be filtered out if you don't have access to them. But you won't get more than 1,000 items if you're using this search root object. So if you want to get more than 1,000 items, you have to do paging. There is a paging root object that makes it a little bit easier to kind of set up the page size and kind of go through this whole process. I've kind of done it raw here, where I've created the paging object, which has a maximum number of items and a page size and a skip count. So the way that paging works is you run a query and you say, give me 100 items, starting at the first item, or the 100th item, or the 200th item. Which is great, but if you're making changes to the content and you get 100 items and you process them, and now the search gets run again. It hasn't cached the search. Now if your search, if you haven't got a sort criteria, you may get items back in a different order, so you want to be careful that you're sorting these things so that your paging is sort of has a chance of working. And you also want to make sure that if you're changing stuff in that set of, in your page, when you go to do the search again, things are going to have moved, right? And so there are things you can do about this. You could run a search, and you could just save the node refs for everything that you find in an array, for example, and then you could iterate over that array, right? So that's one way you could do that. Another way you could do it is you could, and actually this is what we mostly do. We'll run through, we'll set our page size to 100, we'll process everything, and then we'll just run the script again, and we'll run it again, and we'll run it again until it doesn't find anything that it needs to process. And we'll just put a loop in this code. But that's just stuff to be wary of. So before we talk about batch processing, I wanted to talk about a couple of gotchas that you're going to run into, and some things that you might be able to do to work around those issues. So the first thing is transactions. Your admin script is going to be run inside of a transaction. And everything that you do in your script is going to be in that one transaction. So if you have 10,000 nodes that you're tweaking, those 10,000 tweaks are going to be in one transaction. I know with Oracle, we had somebody write a script like this, and the redo log was 35 gigabytes. And the database got really, really slow, right? So there is actually a really cool open source project called alfresco-jscript-extensions, and I'll talk about it a bit more later. One of the things it has is the ability to actually control transactions. If you don't have that, there's a trick you can do. There's an action in Alfresco for running a script. So you can have a setup where you have two scripts. One script says, hey, is there any more work to do? If there is, it uses the execute script action to run a second script. And that's the worker. So that second script, you can indicate that it gets its own transaction, right? So it maybe processes 10 things and then quits, and then the other script runs. Now, if you're using search and you have a solar delay, you have to be aware of that as you're doing this. It's not, just completely straightforward and simple, but it is doable. And we've processed hundreds of thousands of nodes using this technique, and it works just fine. We tend to do this with basically, we'll do the same thing. We'll run the script, we'll kind of process a bunch of stuff, and then we'll run it a second time after a while after the index has caught up, or a third or fourth. So that's transactions. The other thing is, with your admin scripts, you're going through and you're changing stuff, and what you're going to find is, if your documents that you're changing are versionable, you're going to get new versions. You probably don't want that. It's going to change the last modified date and the last modifier. A lot of times your admin scripts, you don't want it to say this was changed by admin on this date, right? Maybe you do. That's fine. If you do, you can ignore this slide. But if that's not okay, the way in Alfresco that you can disable the versioning behavior and you can disable the setting of the last modified date and the last modifier is to temporarily turn off behaviors on the auditable and the versionable aspects. We do this in Java code all the time, but we can do it from JavaScript. And the way that we're doing that here is this script will only run if you're in a secure environment, because we're using that packages root object I talked about. So on that first line, we're doing packages.org.spring. So that's some Java path, package. .get current web application context. So that's a singleton, and it's getting an instance of that. That's a Java object, but I can now interact with that context object through JavaScript. I'm not going to talk through this whole thing in a lot of detail, other than to just point out, what we're doing here is we're getting the Spring application context. We're pulling in the policy behavior filter bean, And then we're able to use that bean to disable behaviors on these two aspects and then re-enable them, right? So I should point out that the JavaScript extensions also has a root object that will allow you to control the policy behavior filtering. So it makes this simpler, and you can use that in an insecure environment. So cool, thank you. So batch processor framework. Basically, this is a Java package in Alfresco, and it has kind of two pieces. There's a provider, which just produces a bunch of work, and then there's a worker, which takes each item of work and does work on it. And the cool thing is you can set a number of threads, and you can indicate how many items per batch, which really means how many items per transaction. Unfortunately, it's not exposed to JavaScript. There are 3 open source projects I'm aware of that will expose this batch processing framework. JavaScript batch executor from Cyber, the alfresco-jscript-extensions that we've talked about a little bit already, and then the enhanced script environment by Axel, who's here today. And each of them have some pros and cons. And in my opinion, the main pro and con is really about, okay, we're doing multi-threading now, right? And we've got JavaScript, which is sort of supposed to be single-threaded. And as long as your actions can be done kind of all within the worker, you should be fine, because they can just kind of, everything's fine. But if you try to access global state, let's say you have a counter, you want to keep track of how many things you changed, you're going to run into a multi-threading problem. And so each of these kind of approaches that in a different way. And then I'm actually going to add a new way, a fourth way that I'll cover. And it looks like I'm running behind, so I'm going to talk a little bit faster now. So the batch executor from Cyber, all it does is batch execution. It has a web script that you can go look at the status of any batches that you're running, which is pretty nice. And then it has a helper where you can give it a folder, and it'll automatically go and get all of the subnodes for you. It doesn't have any techniques for mitigating the concurrency issues with global state. So here's a couple of examples that I'm actually going to just skip past to save a little bit of time. So the alfresco-jscript extensions, they have a bunch of root objects that they add to Alfresco. There's auth for being able to run scripts as different users. There's batch, which is for batch processing. There's policies that allows you to enable and disable versioning and auditing and other things. There's a JMX client. I think Alfresco 4.2 actually has an out-of-the-box JMX client now. There's a jobs for looking at jobs. There's some Solar stuff. And then there's transaction control. And their batch processor, they have a helper where instead of you having to produce the list of stuff to work on, you can give it a Lucene query, and it will, you just give it a worker, you give it a query and a worker, and the worker will get called one time for each result for the query. Unfortunately, this isn't working with 4.2.2 and 4.2.3 at the moment, and there's a bunch of build problems. And Jens Goldhammer, who wrote this, knows about it. He's switching it over to Maven, and it should be sort of generally available, I'm guessing, in the next month or so. And the third one is the enhanced script environment from Axel. And this basically, as I understand it, it's kind of rips out the runtime that Alfresco uses. It puts in a new runtime, still based on Rhino. But it has a kind of a much, it's a much more broad kind of approach. So you can do remote JavaScript debugging using Eclipse, which is pretty neat. That he has a JavaScript, syntactically valid JavaScript way of doing imports, which is pretty cool. I won't use this in production because it's too complex. It's too deep of an integration. It's a great proof of concept, but I won't use it. I use it for fun stuff, but not for production. So one thing that I wanted to talk about is you can actually make your own root objects. So this is an example where I've created a root object called concurrent. And basically, all it's going to do is give me the ability to get a thread-safe integer, which is just a Java thing that exists in the Java concurrent package. And then I can use that, and it's a Java object, but it has a method on it called increment and get, and I can just call that from JavaScript. So basically, in order to create a root object, all you have to do is create a bean where the parent is base JavaScript extension, and it has a property called extension name, and that extension name is the name of the object as it shows up as a root object in JavaScript. And then your code, your Java code, has to extend base processor extension. And then there's basically this magic interrupt, so your methods, I mean, you can kind of get deep into this. If you want to have JavaScript functions passed into your Java code, you have to be a little bit aware, but it's pretty powerful. So in summary, I hope that at the end of this you could maybe use some of these tools to be even more of a content hero than you already are. I would reinforce that you should know what you're doing and understand that there's pros and cons to each of these approaches. And if you do this, I really predict that it will be something that you will use regularly, every week probably, if you're interacting with Alfresco on a daily basis. So next steps, download the full deck from the summit.alfresco.com site. Install the JavaScript console. It's awesome. Read up on the existing root objects. There's a bunch of doc on docs.alfresco.com. And then consider installing some of these other third-party tools that give you kind of extra features in JavaScript, or even make your own. And that's it. Thank you so much. So we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Go ahead.
You were talking about the secure versus insecure
Yep.
JavaScript. Is there a way to set that, or how is that?
It really depends on how the script is kicked off. So if you have a JavaScript web script that's on the class path, it will be secure. But if you have a web script that's coming from the repo, it's not secure. And the admin scripts, if you run them through the Alfresco execute script action, they're not secure, but if you use the JavaScript console, they are. If you're using Java code to run JavaScript, you can control it. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Anything else? Yeah.
What's the best way to do logging for very big log files?
What I tend to do is just use logger.warn, and I put a prefix in front of each of my log statements, and then I just go grep through the Alfresco log and extract it.
But the enhanced environment would have a logger for each script, possibly.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you're looking for values of custom properties, which search do you have?
Values for custom properties?
For example, look for properties of your own
Yeah.
custom model.
Yeah, I mean, I would just use a Lucene or a CMIS query depending on. Is that your question? Yeah. So I would typically in a script I would typically use a Lucene query, but like if I'm working on something where I have some CMIS code and I need to extend that, I might start with the CMIS query. Either way will work just fine. Anything else? Great. Thank you all so much.